So I want to be very brief because I know we have a very, very tight schedule today. But I want to first and foremost thank all of our speakers and our moderator today for joining us. We appreciate your feedback and also your commentary on this really, really important issue. And we're glad we're talking about it today as a larger part of SID-W's work on DEI issues. So we are appreciative of your commentary. I'd also like to thank our fabulous work group co-chairs who will be speaking momentarily, Lisa Phillips and Kara McBride, who helped put this event together. I know happy to see this come to fruition from the planning meeting. So really excited to see what comes out of this today. So I wanted to just start off the top with that. I just want to make a couple of notes. One about, I'm sure most of you are aware of who we are. But we are a neutral convener in the international development space to provide information, so that way you can kind of get a sense of what's going on in the field, but also networking. We realize that's very important, and that's one of our core missions. So we host events like this all the time. So check out our website. That's where all of our updated information will be. We have several events coming up over the next few weeks. I think it's 6 or 7 over the next 3 weeks. So check out our website. That's where all the updated information will be. That does not include our annual conference, which is coming up on May 26th and 27th. So make sure to sign up for that. Registration is not open quite yet, but it will be very, very soon. We are announcing bits and pieces of it as time goes on. So just check out our website. You'll see when registration is posted for that. So enough for that. So a couple of things about the event before we get started. One, as you may see in the left-hand corner, this event is being recorded. We will be posting it to our YouTube channel after the start of the event, at the end of this event. So if you missed something, don't worry about it. It will be we made publicly available to everybody who RSVP'd. And then lastly, about the formatting of this event. So each speaker will be have a short presentation of about 10 minutes. At the end of that 10 minutes, there will be a 2-minute Q&A from all of you, so specifically for each speaker and their presentation. So for that reason, please feel free to send questions throughout the course of the event, and we will address them as soon as we can. So I just wanted to say that. And with that, I will hand it over to the co-chairs. So Lisa and Kara, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Paul. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Education for Development Working Group. We thank you all for being here with us today. We're looking forward to your participation and hearing from our diverse panel of subject matter experts. My name is Lisa Phillips from World Vision, and I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Education for Development Working Group. My co-chair will introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kara McBride. I'm a senior education specialist at World Learning. I'm the other co-chair of the working group, Education for Development at SID-W. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this extremely important discussion. Back to you, Elisa.
Thanks, Kara. So now I'll introduce our moderator, Dr. McManus. You can see his full bio on our website. He will then introduce our panel. Dr. Jojo McManus is an associate with Delta Developmental, an educational innovator. Dr. McManus began his career in higher education as faculty and teacher education at Florida A&M University, and has lectured, served on panels, presented. He's consulted in the US and internationally for nearly 3 decades, serving at higher education institutions ranging from an HBCU or a historically black college university, and an Ivy League institution, and an international university. This would be the University of Malawi. He's also keynoted, he's presented papers, facilitated workshops at numerous conferences, such as the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in American Higher Education, the White Privilege Conference, and the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations Forum. At present, he is finalizing his upcoming book titled Casey's Brother: What I Have Learned About Living an Anti-Racist Life. Now I'll hand over to Dr. McManus.
Thank you, Elisa, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to hear our panelists' thoughts on anti-racism in education and domestic US and international context, so I will do my best to keep the introduction brief. First, let me say Ramadan Kareem, wishing all the blessings of the holy month to everyone observing. I would also like to offer a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from Kingston, Massachusetts in the United States, the colonized indigenous home of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag peoples. And let me say that I'm honored to serve as your moderator today. Before I introduce our exceptional group of panelists, let me set the stage a bit. This past year has been challenging to all of us in many different ways, and is at least in part why we're all staring at a computer screen right now, and so often these days. One centuries-old challenge that we continue to face, which has become even more obvious over the past year, is systemic racism. The Black Lives Matter hashtag, protesting the long history of extrajudicial murder of African Americans by police, became a truly global movement to oppose systemic racism and intersectional oppressions. As educators, this has been another reminder that we must redouble our efforts toward transforming our educational systems from one of the primary sources of global racism to becoming forces for racial justice and counter-colonialism. Today's panel is one of the many conversations going on around the world focused on this difficult challenge. And it's my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists who will provide us with their insights. I'll give you a brief description of each panelist in the order that they will speak so that we will be able to move quickly between their presentations and so that we can see how each speaker is connected to the topic at hand, anti-racism in education. Our first panelist today is Allison Mann. Ms. Mann is an exceptional early childhood educator at one of my favorite Boston public schools in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States. She's committed to teaching through a social justice lens where students are taught to be critical thinkers so that they can identify and combat biases. As a teacher leader, among other work, she's co-created the school's anti-racist committee. And finally, of note, she has been featured in the Learning for Justice magazine for her outstanding work as an educator. Allison will speak with us about her anti-bias and anti-racism work at the school level. Next, we will hear from Dr. Darrell Howard. Dr. Howard is an equity instructional specialist in the Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, also in the United States. His work and research includes race and cultural proficiency, social emotional learning, and the triumphs and challenges of African American male students. He's also the author of Complex People, Insights at the Intersection of Black Culture and American Social Life. Darrell will speak with us about his work at the school district level. And our third speaker will be Dr. Barbara Trudell. Dr. Trudell serves as the director of SIL Africa Learning and Development. She's lived and worked in the Global South for nearly 40 years. First in Peru and then in sub-Saharan Africa, and she currently resides in Cape Town, South Africa. Her research, advocacy, and consulting work is focused on minoritized language communities, and in particular, the use of languages for learning and communication. Barbara will round us off by speaking with us about her experience addressing racism at the international level. As you can tell, we have a great lineup, which will be followed by time for questions. And in order to keep that as much time for questions as possible, I will not ramble any further. Let's please welcome our first panelist, Allison Mann.
Good morning, everybody. I love seeing everybody's faces. I was waiting for the applause. I forgot we're muted, but you can show me your reactions. You can show me your applause, show me your thumbs up, you know. Great, I like participation. Good morning, thank you for having me here today. Like Dr. Jojo said, I'll be speaking to you about what anti-racism can look like in a school setting. So I would like to start by setting some context. So next slide, please, of where I'm teaching. So I teach in a school that goes from pre-K to 8th grade of over 400 students. 89% of my students are identified as non-white, 55% are English learners. We are a full inclusion school, which means that we do not have separate classrooms for students with disabilities. Everyone is in one classroom. We are committed to serving the whole child. We are a full service school, which means that we provide services such as counseling, food support, and we're connected to a community health center. So we're not just about, the academics, we think about the whole child, whole day. We have received the Seal of Excellence from Human Rights Campaign while welcoming schools, which means we do a really great job of being welcoming and inclusive and talking about issues for students who identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community. We have engaged in social justice work for over a decade. So this conversation is not new to us. I came to the school and it was already happening. What is new though, is our focus on anti-racism. So for the past 4 years, this has been a real focus for us. And that's because we found that whenever we talk about issues of race, we get shy, we back away. I mean, we can't do that. We wanted to be focused. So before I talk to you about what that looks like, I'm going to talk to you about some definitions that will be helpful for us as we go through my presentation. So if you go to the next slide. So the first one is bias. And bias is defined here as, sorry, I gotta make my screen nice and big, an inclination or preference either for or against an individual or group that interferes with impartial judgment. And I got this definition from the Anti-Defamation League. The next definition is anti-bias education. I'm just going to focus on the bold words for you guys, for you all today, and that is to increase understanding of differences and their value to a respectful and civil society, and to actively challenge. I'm emphasizing the actively challenge part. Bias, stereotyping, and all forms of discrimination in schools and communities. It incorporates inclusive curriculum that reflects diverse experiences and perspectives. And why you're all here today, anti-racism, what does that mean? Here's the definition that we came up with in our school. Again, I'm going to focus on the bolded part. So anti-racism identifies, challenges, and changes the values, structures, and behaviors that uphold the power imbalances that systemic racism has created. It is an active way of seeing and being in the world. So I'm going to highlight for you how we are active in my school, how we challenge, and how we're interrupting. Because being knowing about your biases, knowing about racism, and how to interrupt it doesn't matter if you're not actively challenging. All right. So next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight this saying that I've been saying a lot with my colleagues. Critical thinking and reflection is work. When we first began our journey, we had a lot of, okay, so how do I, what lessons do I do? What am I going to be teaching with my kids? Action without thoughtful reflection, without critical thinking, can lead to more harm. And, it's a little bit white supremacy thinking. We want to interrupt that. We got to be critical thinkers and we have to reflect. So one of the first things that we did, next slide, is by looking at our curriculum. So we used the 7 forms of bias as identified by the Myra Sedgwick Foundation. It's looking at curriculum and trying to see what biases are in the curriculum. So we started with that. We looked at all materials. We practiced together in professional development. So I led our staff through doing that. First we modeled, then we looked at the actual materials that we're using in front of our actual children, and we just practiced, did it every PD until we got better and better. And eventually it became a habit. And so now it's just part of teachers' planning process. Whenever we're planning a lesson or a unit, or it's in the back of our minds, what biases might be in the materials I'm presenting to my students? What biases am I intentionally upholding? This can be used with texts, with images, manipulatives, anything that a teacher might use in their instruction. I teach early childhood. I can do this. My science teachers who work with our 8th graders, they can use this. And I think it's a great resource. So what I'm going to do for you all is I'm going to drop this link in the chat so you can check it out. Dropped. Okay. I forgot to time myself. Paul, can you give me like when I have like 2 minutes left? Will you tell me? Thanks. All right, we can move on to the next slide. So after thinking about and reflecting on trying to find biases, we started working on identity work. And this quote was our guiding quote throughout that journey. So this is from Zora Neale Hurston. I remember the very day that I became colored, but I am not tragically colored, right? So what we wanted to do was interrupt how we think about people from historically marginalized communities. Oftentimes when we're talking about racism and how to interrupt it, we start with the tragic, the trauma. We are not only our trauma, we are full and complex people. And so the way that we talked about that with our staff is we all engaged identity work. So what are the identities that you hold? What was a time when someone interacted with you based on how they perceived your identity? We created our personal narratives. We reflected on a time when we didn't have control over how people identified ourselves and how that made us feel. We then transferred that into, well, what identities do our students hold? What are the ones that our students state? And what are the identities that we put on them? And how does that come into play when we interact with them? We thought it was important to honor the power of stories. Storytelling was really important in a lot of cultures, and this allowed us to try and practice telling stories. It also was an entry point for folks, for all folks. So often with identity work, what happens is folks will focus on the trauma part, right? So I don't know if you've ever engaged in a privilege walk, which I'm not saying they're terrible, I'm just saying they're not great. Privilege walks are usually like, step forward if you have experienced being called a racial slur. Step back if you've experienced X. What usually happens is people of color are usually all the way in the back and white people are in the front. And that doesn't really doesn't help us to be critical thinkers. What we did here was everyone comes in, you choose what identity you are holding, you choose how when you were othered, and then let's now link it to our student work. What was great about this is some teachers took our activity and did it with their students in real time, right? So they had their students do our identity work. And what that did was setting up their conversations from, instead of coming in as a deficit model, what are some ways that you identify students, and we can use it in our instruction. Cool. All right, next slide, please. After engaging in some identity work for ourselves, we started looking at current events at the time. So this was, years ago, so some current events. So we used the 7 forms of bias again, but instead we looked at how media talked about the current events. What were the ways that biases were upheld in the media? And then what happens when we read that without thinking about it and then come and interact with our students? You'll see some images. Is that my 2-minute mark? Yes, okay. So you'll see our first picture at the top is Laquan McDonald. He was murdered by the police. The way the news talked about him was he was a criminal. He was troubled. When really the police had no, first of all, police shouldn't murder anybody, but like the way they characterized him was as a criminal, whereas the person below him, Mark Condon, actual criminal, he was in Austin, he bombed a lot. Okay, thank you. He was bombing in Austin. The way he was characterized in the news was he was a good kid. He fit in everywhere. This is surprising. And maybe he was, but it's just the differences. We compare and contrast the different ways that the news talks about both of those people. And what does that mean and translate in our practice? We also talked about refugees coming from Central America and how that was characterized in the news. And we are a school that has a lot of students coming from Central America, and they're hearing this. And then at the time, there's also fear, like, am I going to be deported? What's happening? We had to have some conversations as a staff about how we talked about it, because we realized we were coming in and talking like upholding some of these biases. We were deliberate in telling, and when we're talking about our stories, to also not just focus on like, what is the news saying, but let's do some unpacking. Let's look at some historical context of why this is happening and how, and also let's hear from refugees themselves. We just did identity work and talked about how we didn't like it when other people were projecting their own sense of our identity, let's not do the same thing when we're speaking. So we had a chance to hear from refugees and their perspectives, and to help us kind of dig deeper and do some unpacking there. All right, next slide, please. All right, so that was a lot of work with teachers, right? Teachers in professional development. And this was, I think this at this point was like 3 or 4 years. I just want to pause and say that our work is ongoing. It's never ending. This is taking a long time. We are now in year 4 of being explicit and direct with this work. But what I'm not sure why some things are missing. Can you press some buttons? There are some words missing on that slide, but nope, just kidding. All right, well, I'll just talk to you about it. So what we realized was that this work can't happen in isolation. This work can't only happen with teachers. This is for our students. It is for our families. They have to be included in this conversation, in this work. So something that I did with one of my colleagues is we created our anti-racist committee. And that is comprised of students. It's comprised of our paraprofessionals, family members, admin, and teachers, all equally represented, all have equal voice in deciding what our policies look like, what our instruction looks like, what curriculum we use, what extra events that we have and hold in our community, what they look like. Because we are doing this work for them. We also conducted an equity audit that helped us to kind of gear and choose our focus. So our equity audit is how we chose to focus on this in our professional development. So it's part of our school professional practice goal. So all teachers are evaluated on making progress towards this goal, which allows us to have space in professional development. Our equity audit also highlighted for us that our students weren't feeling heard. So that's why we wanted to include them in our committee to make sure that their voices are never forgotten. This work is for them. All right, some next slide. All right, so some things. What could this look like in your context in your school? I think maybe a great first step is looking at that 7 forms of bias and looking at your curriculum materials. Try it out. Try it a couple times, try it a couple more times until it becomes ingrained and it's easy in practice for you to do. There is another activity that I created to help you kind of practice using that with media. And how to use that, looking to be critical about news, articles, images you see in the media. And then I also think it's important to find out from your community what they think work needs to be done in terms of moving towards anti-racism. Include all the stakeholders in your community, okay? I'm gonna drop this link in your chat and then I will take your questions. I will not drop this link in the chat because I can't find it. Oh, here we go. Okay. And Paul, am I just reading the questions from the chat here?
We will be feeding, myself, Kara, and I will be sending them to JoJo.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. So thank you, Allison. We have a couple of minutes to answer some questions now, and then we'll come back again at the end and we'll be able to answer some more. So we've got a list of questions for you. I'm going to start with one from the audience. What, if any, have been the challenges in implementing this from colleagues, parents, kids, and/or other leadership? And did any tension surface? And if so, how did you and your school handle them?
Sure. So I will say the challenge, families and students were not the ones challenging this work. They were asking for it. They were demanding it. So we had to respond to them. And I will say I'm fortunate to be in a school where my school leaders are also not challenging this work, right? So they're also very responsive to hearing from families. So I did feel supported in that way. In professional development, in our PD sessions, there was some resistance to the unlearning that we had to do. What helped, I think, was that my co-facilitator and I were also part of the process. So while we were facilitating the learning, we were also participating in the learning. We weren't coming into the floor as experts. It was, we will help you curate these resources and you will practice it and learn it together. We're in this work. So we were facilitator participants is what we called ourselves, to help us navigate that challenge. And also the first year, it was pretty like silent. And then by now, people are pretty, there's dialogue, there's actual dialogue happening. There's respectful, healthy debate and pushing back where people are okay with being uncomfortable and okay with participating.
Okay. There was a follow-up to that question. On the positive side, what impact have you observed since implementing this curriculum design model? So I'm curious to hear what kind of impact you've had, not only on your students and the community maybe, but also in the way that instruction is done in the school.
Sure. So I'm trying to think of where to start. So I'll say this. So I'll start with our students. So what has been really cool to see is seeing how our voices of our students have been amplified and how they've been really vocal about advocating for themselves. And not only in terms of anti-racism and anti-racist education, but also thinking about what space they hold and how do they ask for what they want. So right now our student leadership is doing some amazing work around social emotional learning. They're asking for some support with that. They're asking for support as they're coming into their own identities and what that looks like for them. But I don't know if they would have been able to do that without this structure before and put in place by us about like, here's a space for you to do that. So that's been really cool to see. I will say teachers' planning has been a lot more thoughtful. I've heard teachers kind of questioning themselves and their peers, like, is this the best way to talk about this topic? Is this like, should we find another source that's more well-rounded, more inclusive, not racist? Like, that's been really great to see.
All right, so now it's time to transition. So thank you, Allison. We'll come back with you at the end. Now let's welcome Daryl Howard and hear about his work at the school district level, also here in the US. Daryl.
All right, fantastic. Thank you for the introduction and great job, Allison. I was intrigued by what you were saying and the work that you're doing at your school. I particularly like the part when you talked about the idea people want to immediately begin applying equity work. They want to do equity work without the reflection and the level of awareness that needs to go into it. So that's something that I'm always thinking about, how to get people on the road to critical consciousness, where you're continuously reflecting on the work that needs to be done. There is no destination. It's a continual journey. So just a little bit about myself, and I did not use slides, everyone. I didn't do that purposefully because I wanted to stay on track with the amount of time that I have here, and I knew I would get distracted if I had slides. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I am what is called an equity instructional specialist in a district here right outside of Washington, D.C. And what I do every day, Monday through Friday in the evenings and often on the weekends, is race and cultural proficiency work. So like Allison is doing work in her school, I am doing it across the entire district. So whether that is training for principals or teachers or bus drivers or food and nutrition workers, we are trying to make sure that our staff is prepared to deal with the diverse student population that we work with. Why is this work hard? So this work is hard is because the United States of America as a society, and I'll probably argue that the globe, across the globe, we would love to have a colorblind society, but that is not really possible if we don't want to talk about the topic of race. Color blindness is simply another way of being color evasive. And in this work, like silence is not a strategy. Oftentimes we think, oh, we just don't talk about it, it'll just go away. That's not the way racism works. And in fact, that's the beauty of the term anti-racism. I think all of us have probably heard the terms diversity, multiculturalism, social justice, inclusion, etc. But anti-racism sticks with people a little bit differently. And the reason why it sticks with people differently is because it has the word racism in it. And with that, it's presupposing that racism exists in that space. It's not offering it as a question. It's not saying maybe it exists there. It's presupposing already, we know racism exists here. So in what ways are we being proactive in dealing with the inequities that we know come along with that? So at the district level, what we try to first start doing with our staff is, number one, we look at them through three essential, what we call essential questions. Essential question one really has to do with helping that educator to be more reflective. As Allison said, that's the key. You have to be reflective. You have to be thinking about your own identity, the skin that you were born in, the racial and cultural experiences that you've had, and then how does that impact your teaching, learning, and leading. Like we are all the individuals God created us to be. We can't change any of that. I can't change my skin color. Dr. Jojo can't change his. Barbara can't change hers. We can't. So we have to work with the skin that we're in and the experiences that we have and ensure that we are reflective of how do I show up in front of young people? And then how do they learn as a result of our interaction? So that's essential question number one. Essential question number two is looking at and learning about the racial and cultural experiences of different students. So how do I, as a Black male educator, what do I know about my Asian American students? What do I know about my Hispanic Latino students? What do I know about my LGBTQ students? How am I continuing to grow in my awareness of who they are in their experiences? And essential question number three is how do I, as an educator, understanding myself, understanding my students, how do I create a space where everybody feels like they're included? How do I create a space where everybody feels like they belong? How do I create a space where nobody feels othered, right? Because othering is a sign of a bias. Like, oh, you're not like me, so I'm going to treat you differently. And that could be in a subordinate way. And we have to be mindful of that through continual reflection. So that's some of the work that we're doing across the district. All of our programs, all of our modules, all of our workshops, all of our presentations are focused on one or multiple of those essential questions that I just mentioned. I think sometimes the work also is hard because people are coming in with a different understanding of what racism is. So we have to make sure that people understand that there are levels to racism. So there is the internalized level of racism, which means that you in the back of your mind have some prejudice, some biases that say, oh, I feel inferior, I feel superior, I feel a certain type of way, disadvantaged or privileged or what have you, as a result of how I show up in the world. So we have to be mindful of internalized racism. The most common type of racism is interpersonal racism. So if you hear somebody call somebody the N-word, or you hear someone treat somebody poorly because they are of a different racial group or different identity or what have you, that's interpersonal racism. So that's still micro level stuff. On the macro level, we need to be looking at institutional racism. And that's what our district is trying to do. We're trying to look at the individual aspects of a school system. So that's one institution. Our government is another institution. The media is another institution. Healthcare industry, family, et cetera. Like all of these are institutions that have inequity tied to them. So we have to recognize that there's institutional racism, and then lastly, there's systemic racism, which is a combination of all of those, right? So how do all of those institutions, how is there a compounding inequity that exists for individuals? And that's what racism looks like. And so in order to have an effective conversation, you have to be talking about the same thing. You can't be talking about an individual or interpersonal experience and somebody else is talking about an institutional experience. You'll never make any headway with that. So our district is looking to do what is called an equity audit. So Allison mentioned her school did one. So our district is doing one. And with that, we are looking at workforce diversity. what is the human resources doing to bring in more diverse candidates? How are we interviewing the ones that we have? How are we recruiting and retaining? One of the issues that I'm connected to through a nonprofit called Bond Educators is looking at more diversity for male educators of color in our school district. 2% nationwide is the number of Black and Hispanic Latino males in this profession. We know that our school populations look different than that. So how can we support a school district in trying to bring in more diverse representation in our classrooms? We have to look at school culture. We have to look at the curriculum, the ways in which we are choosing text to present to and share with students, instructional practices, school resource officers, how we're looking at discipline, community relations. So we're doing an entire audit to see what it reveals about inequities that may be existing in our district. And then ideally, what will happen is we will look at the ways in which we can change those practices and then make those practices into policy. And that's some of the work that I'm doing at the state level. So now I'm talking from district to state. I sit on the task force, Maryland State Department of Education's task force for equity and achievement for African-American male students. Ever since I graduated my master's degree over 20 years ago, I've been studying the disproportionality that exists in outcomes for African-American male students. Of course, that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm just curious about how can we continuously look at data that says that Black boys are the lowest in terms of academic outcomes, standardized testing, graduation rates, college acceptances, yet the highest in referrals, suspensions, expulsions, arrest. So either we're saying that Black boys are pathologically predisposed to negative outcomes, or systemically we need to do something different. And I'm pushing us to do something different. And that requires looking at practice, looking at policy. We've been looking at this data forever, and what we don't change, we choose. So I want to make sure that if I'm looking at something that needs to be changed, I'm acting on it. I think I have maybe about 40 seconds left. I'll just say that racism, the only thing that it needs to survive is silence. That's all it needs to survive. Just look the other way. And that's another beautiful thing about anti-racism. You just say, well, I'm not racist. Well, you can see all this racism around you, but I'm not racist. Either you're actively against it or you're silently complicit in allowing it to exist. So people have to make the decision on where they're going to be with these types of conversations if they really want to change some of the things that they are concerned about in their society, but also how does that trickle down into our schools? So I'll close it there.
All right, thank you, Dr. Howard. I appreciate the presentation, and we only have a little bit of time for questions, but let me just ask you to maybe expand a little bit on what you're speaking about, the difference between a non-racist or I'm not racist perspective to an anti-racist perspective when we're talking about policy and practice, right? What does that look like on the institutional level, not just the individual? And then we'll move on to the next presentation.
So I think leaders drive this work. There can be a groundswell in a community, it can be a groundswell in certain schools. But if leaders are resistant to doing this type of work, that causes it to move much more slowly than it naturally would. And I think leaders have to be trained much more regularly than what individuals are being trained right now. And that's what we've noticed in our district, and that's what we're trying to adjust to, making sure our leaders are trained so it can trickle down into the schools.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll definitely be continuing that conversation at the end. So thank you, Daryl. Now let's welcome Dr. Barbara Trudell to continue our conversation. Take it away, Barbara.
Thank you very much. You have my slides up there. So we've been hearing these amazing insights on fighting racism from our two colleagues here. And honestly, you were both amazing. I feel so privileged to be here with you. Oh, I've lost my slide. Well, I can start anyway. Yes, go to the first slide. Yeah. So racism has an international face as well. If you work in international education, international development, then you've probably been in places where you're not of the same race as those around you. And in this context, racial differences can slide very easily into racism, whether you recognize it or not. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. So here are 3 short lessons on international development and racism. Lesson number 1 is globalization. If you look at the features of globalization processes, you see the dominant language is English, the dominant culture is mainstream American, the dominant color is white. This is inherently racist. And you can see it the most clearly when these cultural factors come into conflict with the societies of the global South. And not only that, but the globalized education system also is not responsive to the realities and needs of kids in the global South. And I'm not sure it's really intended to be responsive to them. I'm not sure that's what they think the point is. So you've got the cultural issues, you've got the education system that is propelled by globalization, and then the values that are associated with globalization can also be highly prejudicial to the global South. Things like good infrastructure, nice roads, stable electricity, internet connectivity, keeping to time, when in fact the excellences of societies of the global South have to do with valuing human relationship, valuing human interaction, awareness of the spiritual dimension of life, the non-material world, the value of community, the value of specific authority structures. None of those really figure in the globalization agenda. And in my limited experience, people in the global South tend not to be fooled about this. So the linguistic capital is useful. The education capital they can access is desirable. The financial opportunities are valuable. But in my experience, they do not want to turn into white America. And the more they know about it, the less they're likely to want to. In fact, you can find a whole lot of critique about the whole thing. My Kenyan friend Pauline said to me once, she said, you know, I'm not black, I'm brown. And you're not white, you are pink. Well, it's not a very prestigious color to me, but she's actually right. Next slide. Lesson 2 has to do with the sense of entitlement that comes with international development work. For example, we believe that we have the right to go anywhere in the world, invited or not, and to take our norms along with us, our clothing, our language, our style of personal interaction. And it's a stereotype, really, isn't it? The inappropriately dressed, rude, loud, English-speaking, white American. I met a young person in Bamenda in Cameroon, and she is a 6-month veteran of international education work in Cameroon, so 6 whole months. And she was complaining about someone who'd been visiting for just 3 weeks and what they had said about their experience in Cameroon. She said, "That's not my Africa." I thought, your Africa? Since when is this continent yours? That's an example of entitlement. Next slide. This sense of entitlement plays out in the notion that we have the answers. A Kenyan pastor once wrote, "You Americans, you bring us solutions to problems we didn't even know we had." Now imagine a heavy dose of sarcasm there along with that. And some of us even here, we talk about education for transformation. But the question is, transformation of whom? And transforming them into what? The assumptions there can be problematic. We also like to think that we have the knowledge that matters. And that in my experience, is inherently racist. I don't have your knowledge, but it doesn't matter because your knowledge isn't important. So many years ago, I made my first attempt at reading instructional materials in another language. It was a variety of Quechua, which is a language spoken in the Peruvian Andes. Now, I hadn't been there very long. I didn't know the language very well. I didn't know the culture very well, but how hard could it be, right? I've had classes in how to do this. I just make the words small and the sentences short, it'll be great. So I started off and I got to about lesson 4. And without knowing it, I wrote a very obscene story. Now, the guy I was working with and the guy I was paying, straight-faced, he said, yeah, sure, that's okay. And then someone else got a hold of it and they laughed their heads off. And actually, my husband said, I probably should have kept the story in because it would have sold more copies. I don't know about that, but I didn't have the language knowledge. I didn't have the cultural knowledge that I needed for this task, but I thought it didn't matter. I had my knowledge. Next slide. In the white English-speaking world, our language is our privilege. We categorize African nations by which former colonial language they speak or don't speak. It's always about their lack of language competency. That's what's on show, not our own. And I'm honestly not sure which is worse, calling the countries of the Western Sahel Francophone Africa, or pointing out frequently that they don't actually speak French very well. Slide 6, next slide. Okay, lesson 3 is, when you are doing international education or development programming, you are a guest. How do you honor your hosts? What does respect look like? You have to make the effort to find out. And in my world, the greatest compliment that you could ever receive from your African colleagues is if they ever tell you, yep, you work with us, but you don't condescend. Next slide. Can I have the next? Yeah. So our task is to be an agent of change and to respect who and what is already there. It's not easy, but it is crucial. You have to learn to understand who and what is there before you have any right to talk about change. And the key questions here are, what do they want? Why do they want it? And how can I help? And I really believe that being ready to let the answers to these questions guide your engagement really allows us to start moving international education and development out of the shadow of racism and into a space of mutual respect and cooperation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. I appreciate the presentation. I think we should probably start off with a question for you, since everybody got a chance to do a question after theirs. I'd like to ask your thoughts specifically on what anti-racism looks like in the educational settings that you've been a part of, and you've been working internationally for a long time. So what does it look like in schools and universities that you've had experience with?
Well, the main formal education experience I've had is in, say, primary schools at that level, the early grade reading and different issues, because that's where language of instruction is really important. I think what you see, and John Meyer actually writes about this, and he's talking about globalization of education, that you see systems that don't actually fit the people there. And teacher practices. You have textbooks imported straight from France or from the United States or from the UK that refer to events and issues and have pictures, little white kids, or the famous one in a French textbook that Gaul is divided into 3 parts. Now that is not something a kid in Mali is ever going to need to know. And yet there they are. So you see it in the textbooks, you see it in the structures, the way that kids are not allowed in if they're not wearing certain kinds of clothes. in my view, that all comes from somewhere else. And it is, I would say, highly prejudicial to the education of the kids there.
Okay, thank you. We had an interesting question that was posed specifically to Daryl, but I'm curious to hear everybody's thoughts. And Daryl, maybe you can kick us off. But it was specifically around psychological safety and how we can establish psychological safety in the classrooms with students that are on different stages in their journey around anti-racism.
So not only are students on different stages of the journey, so are the teachers. So recognizing that everybody is learning and growing in that space, I think that's what one should aspire to have in their classroom, that type of classroom culture where we're all learning together. I am the facilitator of knowledge as the educator, but I am not the one who is bestowing knowledge upon you. We are all learning together, we're growing together, and sometimes we're going to get it wrong, and we have to be restorative in our relationships and say, hey, you know what, I got that wrong yesterday. We need to try and do something differently, something better that allows for more voices, that allows for people's perspectives to be heard. I always often say having an equity mindset, very similar to a growth mindset. Like you're a risk taker, you're being curious, you know you might get it wrong, you accept constructive feedback. You got to be that same way about equity. There is no perfect way for it. You just have to create it in your classroom.
I would actually,
Allison.
sorry, I just jumped in, my bad, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to ask you your thoughts, Allison. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Daryl was saying. I will say that that sometimes as adults we overthink things. And what helped in my school was adults were having these conversations, and so it made it a little bit easier to provide space for students to have the conversations. Some things, like some concrete things that might be helpful, is the same way that you would create norms, like include those in part of your classroom norms, right? So what happens when somebody says something that is hurtful? How do you restore from that? Also, like Daryl was saying, I am a facilitator of learning. I am not the holder of all learning, so we can learn together. So if I'm the one as the teacher in this situation who's holding the power, if I'm saying something or doing something that is racist or wrong, how can I create space and safety for students to come and say to me, that hurt me, let's repair. I think norms have been great. Making it part of your classroom like culture or like routines, right? So there's a routine in your classroom that we are going to have conversations together. It's not once in a while when something harmful happens. It's just part of our way of being.
Mm-hmm. I think you hit on something that's really important. I think making anti-racism the norm in a school, in a classroom is critically important, that it's not something we do a particular month or a particular when something happens, but it's just normal, right? We got another question that I think really starts to bring us to the connection between the US and international work. This question was, are there differences between how racism manifests in post-colonial societies versus the United States? Although I would say we also are a post-colonial society. And how can American professionals in particular learn to address systemic racism without obliviously transposing US perceptions and assumptions about racism onto global Southern countries? Did y'all get that? It's kind of long, but y'all got it?
Great question.
Okay, well, Barbara, why don't you kick us off?
Well, at least in my experience in sub-Saharan Africa, racism looks different. I mean, except for in South Africa, most of the people are what an American would assume was the same color. And so there are certainly dominant races and subordinate races amongst them. And I think our assumptions about, when the only white person in the room is you, then it looks different. It just does. And you have to understand, why am I feeling like I should be in control here? Why am I feeling like I can never be wrong? Why am I feeling like, I have to I have to criticize everything I can find because it makes me feel like I actually am in control here. So I think often it turns into an individual experience. I think if you want to talk about institutional issues, you could talk about the international education donors and so on, and what they're messaging to the government. When you have lots of money, your race tends to be, appreciated more than when you don't. And people put up with a lot, I would say, from us.
I think that starts to speak to neocolonialism. Daryl or Allison, do you have thoughts?
Okay, so yes, it's interesting you mentioned neocolonialism. I don't know if I have anything that can contribute in such a short amount of time. The answer would be way too long. We might want to grab some coffee on that, man. That's a good one about neocolonialism for sure. Yeah, so I'll pass. I'm going to pass.
Allison?
Same.
Okay. I will just say that neocolonialism looks a lot like old school colonialism in its impact.
Yeah, it does.
And we'll all join each other for coffee, hopefully in the near future, to continue that conversation. Let's see. Let me pull up another question. This question is that I heard reflection being critical for teachers and others in education, right? That they reflect on what they're doing. What thoughts do you have on how we can better encourage reflection for teachers in developing countries who are under-resourced and have less training in general?
Can you say the last part of that question one more time?
Sure. What thoughts do you have on how we can better encourage reflection for teachers that are in developing countries and may not have the resources and the types of trainings that may be available other places?
I think I'm confused by this question. Are you asking about resources to be reflective?
Asking about, how teachers can be more reflective, right, about their own practice. And, maybe there isn't, I'm guessing here a little bit, but maybe there isn't the same sort of training to encourage that introspection, particularly around issues of race and racism.
So for me, I guess one has to ask the question of availability of resources and where those resources come from, and what is the messaging, what is the symbolism, what's the content in those resources. Just as there are curricular issues that carry certain storylines here in the United States, those same things can exist in other parts of the world, depending upon who is the author of that particular narrative. Mm-hmm. So for me, this work has to do with expanding the narrative, expanding the canon, right? Which individuals are we told that we have to read in our 10th grade year, and why, in our 11th grade? And so we have to expand that canon to be to have more perspectives, multiple perspectives. But the challenge with that is then we have to allow for individuals that are critical of the history of this country, which would then disrupt these ideas around American exceptionalism, meritocracy, et cetera. And some people do not want that narrative to be disrupted.
Mm-hmm. Allison, I'm watching your face, and so I'm wondering what you're thinking, and if you'd like to share.
Sure. I guess I think I heard the question differently. And so my first thought was, here's what I heard. We want to invite teachers to be reflective, but how do we do that in developing countries that don't have resources to be reflective? And what confused me about what I thought I heard was that you don't need special resources really to be reflective. And so maybe what the challenge here is, or what the, I guess the support would be, is providing the space, or like maybe modeling the questioning. Like, let's question what our resources, or let's question what the issues that we have, and look deeper at them. It's helpful to have like a protocol or a tool, but you don't always need those. So I was a little bit, so I think I was just thinking of a different question that was asked. That's what the face was.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, we are at time. So I do want to thank everybody. I want to encourage everyone to continue these conversations. They're really critical, regardless of what context you're working in. And I want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of it, and thank our excellent panelists for their time and their wisdom. And I'll pass it on. I think Paul has got some closing points that he needs to make for us.
Yes, great. Thank you everybody for for this fascinating conversation. It was really, really great. I know one question that came up in the chat was about sharing speaker information with everyone on the call, and perhaps RSVPs, if that is okay with, I guess, all of you, Allison, Daryl, Barbara, and JoJo. We can go ahead and do that in our follow-up email that should be going out within about the next week and a half, if that's okay. Okay, thumbs up from JoJo. I saw Daryl's okay with that. Allison, okay, great.
Sure.
Okay, great. Okay, so we will do that. And as I said, sometime within the next week to week and a half. As is mentioned, Melina, if you can move it to the next slide, please. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on this event. We really take it into consideration when we do our programming and start planning our future programming. So my colleague Jamal posted posted the survey link in the chat box. If you would be so kind to fill that out, I will post it in there again, just because I saw there were a few other messages that came up after that. So there's a survey link. We would really appreciate your feedback. So please fill it out. And with that, I will close today's event. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we ran a little bit late, but we appreciate you all staying on. Thank you.
Thank you.